The room went completely silent. 300 people. Not one of them moved. A grown man in the front row slowly covered his face, and began to cry. And all of this was because of a 10-year-old boy. A boy who had just been asked one question. Where is Allah? But before we get to that answer, the answer that stopped 300 people cold, you need to understand how a child named Yusuf ended up standing alone on that stage. Because this story doesn't begin in that conference hall. It begins 3 weeks earlier. In a small apartment. With a boy sitting by a window, watching rain fall on the streets of Detroit. Yusuf was 10 years old and he asked questions the way other children breathe. His mother, Fatima, often said that from the moment he could speak, he never stopped. Why does the sky go dark, Mama? Why do people die? Why does Allah let bad things happen? She would answer as best she could. But some questions, she admitted, were too big for her alone. They lived in a modest apartment in the east side of Detroit. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen that always smelled of cardamom and bread. His father, Ibrahim, worked long shifts at an auto parts warehouse and came home exhausted every night, but never too exhausted to sit with Yusuf for at least 20 minutes before bed. Those 20 minutes were sacred. Ibrahim would open a worn copy of the Quran, its cover taped together from years of use, and he would read. And then Yusuf would ask. And Ibrahim would answer. One night, about a month before everything changed, Yusuf asked his father something that made Ibrahim go quiet for a long time. Baba, he said. Where is Allah? Not like, in a place. But really. Where is he? Ibrahim looked at his son for a moment. Then he smiled, the slow, warm smile of a man who has carried that same question his whole life. That one, he said softly, you will have to find yourself. Yusuf did not forget that answer. He turned it over in his mind for days. He thought about it walking to school. He thought about it during math class. He thought about it lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. Where is Allah? He didn't know it yet, but in 3 weeks, he would be asked that question in front of 300 strangers. And his answer would change something in every single person in that room. It was Yusuf's school teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who first suggested it. She had noticed something about Yusuf that most adults eventually noticed, that when he spoke, people listened. Not because he was loud. Not because he was dramatic. But because he said exactly what he meant, in exactly the words that fit, and then he stopped. The Faith, Science and Humanity International Dialogue Forum was held every year in downtown Detroit. It was a prestigious event. Academics. Theologians. Scientists. Journalists. People who spent their careers asking the biggest questions humans can ask. This year, the organizing committee had decided to include a youth segment. Young voices. Fresh perspectives. Mrs. Patterson submitted Yusuf's name without telling him. When the letter arrived at their apartment, a formal envelope with the forum's gold seal, Fatima held it for a long time before opening it. Then she called Yusuf to the kitchen table. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. They want me to speak? They want you to participate in a panel discussion, Fatima said carefully. With professors. And scientists. Yusuf was quiet for a moment. What if they ask me something I don't know? Fatima looked at her son. She thought about what Ibrahim would say. She thought about all those nights, the worn Quran, the 20 sacred minutes. Then you tell them that, she said. You tell them you don't know. And then you tell them what you do know. That's enough. Yusuf folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. He carried it with him for the next 3 weeks. In the 3 weeks that followed, Yusuf prepared, but not in the way most people prepare for something like this. He didn't write a speech. He didn't memorize answers. He didn't practice in front of a mirror. Instead, he asked more questions. He went to the local masjid and sat with Sheikh Tariq, an elderly scholar with a white beard and slow, careful words, and he asked everything he had been thinking about. What does it mean for Allah to be everywhere? How can something be in no place but also in all places? How do you explain something that is beyond explanation? Sheikh Tariq did not give Yusuf a script. He gave him something better. He gave him a framework, a way of thinking. And then he told him something that Yusuf would carry onto that stage 3 weeks later. Yusuf, the sheikh said, placing a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. You don't need to explain Allah to anyone. You only need to tell them where you found him. That is enough. That is always enough. Yusuf sat with that for a long time. Where had he found Allah? He thought about the night his grandfather died, 2 years ago. The way the whole family had gathered. The way his father had wept quietly and then stood up and said Alhamdulillah, all praise to Allah, even through his tears. Yusuf had not understood that then. He was beginning to understand it now. He thought about the morning he had watched a caterpillar build its cocoon on the windowsill. The way it wrapped itself so completely, so patiently, as if it already knew what was coming. He thought about the first time he had prostrated in prayer and felt, just for a moment, that the floor beneath his forehead was not just floor. He found Allah in those places. And when the night before the forum finally came, he did not feel afraid. He felt ready. The morning of the forum, Yusuf woke before far. He performed wudu in the dark bathroom, the cold water on his face sharp and clarifying. He prayed. Then he sat on his prayer mat for a long time afterward, not praying, just sitting. Just being still. Fatima made him breakfast but he barely touched it. Ibrahim tied his tie for him. They had bought a simple beige blazer from the thrift store the week before, and a white dress shirt that Fatima had ironed 3 times. When they arrived at the conference center, Yusuf stopped at the entrance and looked up. The building was enormous, glass and steel, reflecting the pale morning sky. Through the revolving doors, he could see the lobby filling with people. Men in suits carrying leather folders. Women in academic robes. Camera crew setting up near the main hall doors. Fatima put her hand on his back. Ready? I think so, Yusuf said. Inside, he was taken to a backstage waiting area. It was there that he first saw Stephen Hartley. Stephen was the forum's lead moderator, a well-known journalist and author who had spent 20 years writing about religion and secularism. He was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a dark navy suit. He walked into the waiting area flanked by 2 assistants and immediately began scanning the room. His eyes landed on Yusuf. He crossed the room and extended his hand, a formal, adult handshake. You must be the young man from the youth segment, he said. His voice was polished, slightly amused. Yusuf, is it? Yes, sir. Stephen looked at him for a moment, the look of a man calculating something. Good, he said. Then he turned and walked away. Yusuf watched him go. Something in that look stayed with him. The youth panel was scheduled for the late afternoon session, after 3 hours of keynote speeches, academic debates, and panel discussions that Yusuf mostly did not follow. He sat in the wings and listened. He heard a physicist from MIT talk about the origins of the universe. He heard a philosopher from Oxford argue that consciousness could not be explained by biology alone. He heard a theologian from Cairo speak about the nature of the divine in 3 different languages. And then, it was his turn. A stagehand touched his arm. You're up. Yusuf stood. He straightened his blazer. He thought about Sheikh Tariq's words. Tell them where you found him. He walked out onto the stage. The first thing that hit him was the light, sharp, warm, flooding down from above. The second thing was the size of the room. From backstage it had sounded large. Standing on the stage, looking out, it was vast. Row after row of faces, stretching back into shadow. 300 people. Maybe more. He walked to the podium. The microphone was too high. A stagehand rushed forward, adjusted it down, and then retreated. Yusuf placed both hands on either side of the podium, a small boy at an enormous dark wooden lectern, bathed in white light. He looked out at the audience. And he felt something unexpected. Calm. Not the calm of someone who doesn't understand the situation. The calm of someone who has already decided that whatever happens next, it will be fine. Stephen Hartley stood at a second podium to his left, index cards in hand, that same slightly amused expression on his face. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen said into his microphone, our final participant today is 10 years old. He is a student at Jefferson Elementary School here in Detroit. His name is Yusuf. Polite applause. The kind given to something people don't quite take seriously yet. Yusuf, Stephen said, turning to face him directly, we've spent all day asking the biggest questions. Scientists. Philosophers. Theologians. So I want to ask you something they've all struggled to answer. He paused. The room was quiet. Where is Allah? The room was silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting. The held-breath silence of 300 people who had just realized that this question they had all been dancing around all day with academic language and careful footnotes, had just been asked directly. To a child. With nowhere to hide. Yusuf did not answer immediately. He looked out at the audience. He found Michael's face, a broad-shouldered man in the front row, arms crossed, the look of a man who had heard everything and believed nothing. He found Professor James, silver beard, round glasses, leaning back with his arms folded, watching with the careful eyes of someone grading an exam. And then Yusuf spoke. His voice was clear. Steady. Quiet enough that the room had to lean in, but the microphone caught every word. My father asked me that question, he began. Not exactly like that. But close. And I asked my sheikh. And my sheikh told me something. He said, don't try to explain where Allah is. Just tell people where you found him. He paused. So that's what I'm going to do. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. A few people who had been leaning back straightened slightly. Stephen Hartley lowered his index cards an inch. I found Allah the night my grandfather died, Yusuf continued. I was 8. My father was crying. And then he stopped, and he said Alhamdulillah. All praise to Allah. Even while he was still crying. I didn't understand that. I went to my mother and I said, Mama, why is Baba saying thank you to Allah when Allah just took his father away? And my mother looked at me and she said, because your father knows something you don't know yet. He knows that everything belongs to Allah. And when something returns to its owner, even when it hurts, you say thank you. Something moved through the room. It was not dramatic. It was quiet. The way a tide moves, you don't see it, but suddenly the water is higher. In the front row, Michael uncrossed his arms. Yusuf continued. I found Allah on a Tuesday morning, he said, watching a caterpillar on my windowsill. It was wrapping itself up. Completely covering itself. And I thought, how does it know? How does it know that when it disappears inside that cocoon, it won't just end? How does it know something is waiting on the other side? And I thought, maybe it doesn't know. Maybe it just trusts. Professor James slowly took off his glasses. I found Allah the first time I made sujud, prostration, and I pressed my forehead to the floor. I don't know how to explain this to scientists and professors. But in that moment, the floor didn't feel like a floor. It felt like the closest I had ever been to something that was holding everything together. Including me. The room was completely still. Yusuf's voice remained steady. Unhurried. Like someone reading from something written long before he was born. So when you ask me where Allah is, I can't give you coordinates. I can't put him on a map. I can't show you a photograph. He paused. And in that pause, something happened in the room. But I can tell you this. He is in every place where a person keeps going, even when they want to stop. He is in every hand that reaches out to someone falling. He is in the part of you that knows, even before your mind catches up, that some things are wrong and some things are right. He is in the question itself. Because only a creature made by Allah would ever think to look for him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. In the front row, Michael's hands moved slowly to his face. His shoulders dropped. And a sound came from him, quiet, barely audible, the sound of something releasing. He was crying. Not dramatically. Not performatively. The way men cry when they have been holding something for a very long time and something small and true finally opens the door. Professor James sat completely still, glasses in his hand, staring at the stage. Stephen Hartley had not moved in 2 minutes. His index cards hung at his side, forgotten. For several seconds, no one moved. Then, starting somewhere in the middle of the room, where a woman in a blue headscarf had pressed both hands to her mouth, the applause began. It did not start loud. It started the way true things start, slowly, then completely. Within 10 seconds the entire hall was on its feet. Yusuf stood at the podium and looked out at them all. He did not raise his hands. He did not bow. He simply stood, small, still, composed, as if none of this surprised him. As if he had always known that the truth, spoken plainly, would eventually reach the people it was meant for. Stephen Hartley walked to the center of the stage. For the first time all day, he seemed uncertain. He raised his microphone. "I have been moderating these forums for 11 years, he said, his voice slightly rough. "I have heard Nobel laureates speak. I have heard heads of state speak." He paused. "I don't know what to say after that." He said nothing else. He simply started clapping. Backstage, Fatima had heard everything through a monitor. She was standing with her hands pressed together against her lips, tears streaming silently. When Yusuf walked off stage, she pulled him into her arms without a word. He hugged her back, a small boy again, just for a moment. "Was it okay?" he whispered. She held him tighter. Professor James found Yusuf in the lobby afterward. He crouched down to eye level, a gesture of unusual humility for a man who had spent 40 years being taller than most of the conversations in his life. "I want you to know something," the professor said quietly. "I have been asking your question for longer than you have been alive. I want you to know, I think you found part of the answer today." Yusuf looked at him. "I didn't find it," he said. "I just said where I looked." Professor James stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "Yes," he said. "Yes. That's it exactly." That evening, Yusuf and his father sat together in the small apartment, the worn Quran between them, the city lights blurring in the window behind. Ibrahim had watched the forum on his phone, in the break room of the warehouse, standing in the corner so no one would see him cry. He hadn't told Yusuf that. "How do you feel?" Ibrahim asked. Yusuf thought about it. "Like I didn't really say anything," he said finally. "Like it was already there. I just pointed at it." Ibrahim was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the Quran. He opened it to a page he knew by heart, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 115. He read it aloud, in Arabic first, then in English. "And to Allah belongs the East and the West. So wherever you turn, there is the face of Allah. Indeed, Allah is all-encompassing and knowing." Yusuf sat with the words. Wherever you turn. Not somewhere up above. Not in a distant place that only the pure can reach. Not behind locked doors that require the right credentials to enter. Wherever you turn. He had known this. Somewhere, he had always known this. But hearing it spoken by his father, in that small apartment, after everything that had happened that day, it settled into him differently. Like something that had been floating finally finding the ground. This is the truth that a 10-year-old boy carried onto a stage in Detroit. Not a truth he invented. A truth he found, the way all real truths are found, by looking honestly at his own life and asking what was really there. He found it in grief that still said thank you. He found it in a caterpillar that trusted the dark. He found it in a forehead pressed to a floor that felt like more than a floor. And 300 people, scholars, scientists, skeptics, and believers, heard him say it. And something in the room, in all of them, went still. Because the truth has a sound. And on that day, in that hall, in the voice of a boy who had not yet turned 11. Everyone heard it. Alhamdulillah.